Welcome to this session, which is all about traveling for work. Well, not just traveling for work, moving abroad for work. So what we are seeing at the moment are some people who have been made redundant, who are looking to move for work. This could be moving further afield in their own country, or moving abroad. And also those people who, as a result of the virus, have changed the way that they're working, and they now work at home virtually. It's been a sudden realization that actually they could do this from anywhere in the world. They could fulfill their dream of living in a castle in Transylvania and doing their work, or they could become a digital nomad and actually sell the house and work from one country 1 year and another country the next. So one woman who knows all about this, the upsides and the downsides, is chartered psychologist Wendy Kendall of globallytalented.com. And today Wendy's going to be talking about how we can set ourselves up for success if we are working and living abroad. So before we get stuck in, Wendy, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself, both professionally and personally, as I know that you've experienced working and living abroad too?
Yeah, hi Paula, it's really great to be here, so thanks for inviting me. Yeah, so, Globally Talented as a company started about 17 years ago when I initially moved to France. And so, times were very different 17 years ago. But it really struck me that, there were things that we could do as psychologists that could actually help people move overseas much more successfully. And I remember at the time I'd come from an environment where I had been a military psychologist, and we set people up so that they could go through these highly disruptive transitions and be very successful and hit the ground running. And yet when I moved overseas, and we moved as part of my my husband's company's relocation process, it really seemed to me that things were stuck in the dark ages a little bit, and people were actually planning for a little bit of a downturn in performance and helping people through an anticipated downturn before they finally returned to previous levels of success. And what struck me was that, why would anyone put themselves through that if they were just going to get back to where life was beforehand?
Yeah. The whole idea is that hopefully it should be a new start, something, better. Yeah.
That's right. Why do we go through such a disruption if it's not going to be better at the end of it? So I really looked at, got underneath and started looking at the science of how we could help people embrace these big disruptive transitions and, avoid some of those U-turns, those U-bends, those U-curves, and hit the ground running and make really a success and kind of embrace the potential of an overseas job move.
Yeah.
So that's the foundation of Globally Talented.
Yeah. And you've worked with a lot of organizations to help them do this for their staff, haven't you?
Exactly, yeah. So, companies also invest a lot of money into moving people overseas. And the experience of going through what they call this U-curve of integration can leave people vulnerable to experiencing downturns in their performance, and also then even leaving the company. So companies got really motivated about not losing people and not losing money on that. But when you're making that investment yourself in moving overseas, and you're maybe selling things off at home, uprooting partners and children, and making really a big personal investment, then I would say it's at least, if not even more important, that you capitalize on that investment and make the best of it.
Yeah. So as you say, setting yourself up for success. So regardless of whether you're deciding to move after redundancy, after you're looking for a job, or whether it's because you like the idea of working virtually, how do you do that? How do you set yourself up for success?
Yeah, well, I think there's 3 areas that I would talk about in terms of what don't commonly get addressed, but that people should think about. That would be building your resilience. And so we'll look at that in a bit more detail. Building your network, of course, that's really important, and people understand that, but there's some tips and tricks that you can employ when it comes to building your network overseas and doing that in a way that brings opportunities to you. And then the final element that I think people don't necessarily think of immediately is building your reputation, because that is the thing that will also bring opportunities to you. And obviously at the moment, people are challenged in terms of building their reputation, where they may have gone and done, deliver conference papers, or they may have gone speaking at events overseas. No one's doing those at the moment. So what can we do about building reputation? So yeah, starting with resilience. I think resilience is one of these terms in psychology and that gets used commonly that we can really unpack, because it covers a lot of different things. For me, when it comes to building resilience in people who are going to be moving overseas, one of the things that I think we have to recognize, first of all, is moving overseas is one of the things that people do that completely fractures their personal and professional lives.
Okay.
And the way that I used to think about this is, you imagine that all of the strands of your life are a little bit like a tapestry, and you're kind of held in that tapestry by all of the threads of your life. And when you move overseas, you snip yourself out of that picture, and then you move yourself to a different part of the picture, and now you have to reintegrate all of those threads. And the more that you reintegrate those threads of your life, the more resilient you are then to external stresses and strains and knocks.
Okay, so that's a really good visual representation. Yeah.
Now, if you're going to be a digital nomad, or if you're going to go through several of those transitions, that kind of implies two things. One, making yourself and your little family unit, whatever that looks like, internally resilient, and then also getting really good at joining up the threads. So there's almost like two skill sets there. So what does that look like, and what are the things that you can concentrate on as someone who's moving overseas or someone who's becoming a digital nomad? One of the key elements, which is really related to being successful in your job anyway, is to know and understand your strengths. And there are so many tools that you can use. Paula, I know you're a real kind of psychometrician, and I'm sure that you use tools with people that help them identify and uncover strengths that they have that they may have overlooked.
Yeah, there are loads out there, aren't there? Strengths Finder. There's a free one, the VIA Institute does a quick and dirty one you can do online. Yeah.
So loads of really good ones that you can get that are not very expensive, and it may be that we can drop some of the kind of links in the notes for this presentation. The interesting thing about strengths is, first of all, they're usually the thing that people overlook the most in themselves, and there's a reason for that, which is strengths come so naturally to us that we think it's what everybody does. And so it's really useful to use some of these tools and to start getting to know what are your strengths and how do you use them. The other thing is that strengths are usually in a certain context. So when you move overseas, the thing you're doing is looking at, how does this strength show up in this new place? So for example, I was working with somebody who was an American that had moved to Norway. And in the USA, her way of working in meetings was very understated, very kind of low key and very consensus building. Now that was one of her strengths. When she moved to Norway, that was an incredible strength for her, because suddenly she was the one who was actually very proactive in meetings. And it was really useful for her to recognize that that was her strengths showing up in a new way. It really built her confidence in terms of connecting with her colleagues. It helped her to feel as though she had a role and a value add that she was bringing. And so in terms of her resilience, recognizing that strength and how it showed up really kind of fed her. So you will find different examples of that. But if you understand and are familiar with your strengths before you move overseas, then seeing how they show up in different ways can just help to really bolster your confidence. And it helps you to pitch yourself. It helps you to write your CV. It helps you to position yourself in interviews if you understand what those are and how they might show up in that new environment. So strengths use is a really important one.
Yeah.
Have you ever come across that with people that you work with as they move to different environments, Paula?
Yeah, I mean, interestingly, I think the whole cultural thing is fascinating. So I've worked with somebody from New York, and you know, the style of meetings there, it's quite assertive, and you know, everyone is expected to put their ideas on the table. And I think he had a bit of a culture shock when he came to London, where everyone's like, oh, well, not quite, but I mean, you know, the whole assertive style, which actually he'd never actually been particularly comfortable with, was out the window, and everyone basically, you know, almost went around the table and had their turn.
Yes.
And that suited him much more.
Yeah.
I can imagine for somebody who is used to that assertive style and that is their style, they would probably have to sort of change it a little bit.
Yeah. Well, there's two really good points that kind of touches on there. One, and this comes into resilience, just working on your self-awareness the whole time. I mean, as leaders, as managers, as colleagues, working on developing your self-awareness. And that usually means things like getting feedback, doing self-reflection, maybe working with a coach or whatever it is, to just develop your understanding of what's going on inside of you when you're interacting with people out there. That is like fundamental to developing your resilience as well.
Yeah.
You can kind of do this U-turn inside and think, okay, what's going on here? Then that in itself will make you more resilient and less prone to kind of stresses and strains. The other element there, which you've picked up on, is when it comes to using your strengths more effectively in a new environment, I have this concept which I call turning your volume up and turning it down. And so for some people, you might need to turn your strengths up a little bit, turn the volume up. And for some of them, they may need to turn the strength down a little bit. So turning the volume down and just moderating and being more flexible. And the really great thing about that is it helps to develop much more flexibility in your leadership style when you can think of turning your volume up and down on certain strengths. And the advantage of that, especially if you're a digital nomad and you're moving overseas time and time again, is you just get really good at staying who you are, staying authentic and using those strengths, but being able to flex them across cultures. So that concept of turning your volume up and down, you know, you're not becoming more or less of who you are, but you're just moderating the volume. So.
Yeah, I like that. Say self-awareness and knowing, when to use your strengths and when just to step back. Yeah.
And turning your volume up might mean using your strength more forcefully, but it might also mean using your strengths much more often, or using them in contexts where you wouldn't have normally applied them. So that assertiveness, if that's coming out mostly in meetings, can you also use it in one-to-one interactions? Can you use it more in presentations? So you might not be just bigger yourself, but just using it across more contexts. Anyway, so that's strengths. I mean, we've touched on self-awareness, and another area that we've just discussed a little bit is this aspect of psychological flexibility. So what we're talking about with strengths and turning volume up and down and being able to flex, the more that you can do that across different environments generally, so if whether that's using your strengths, whether it's using your skills differently, whether it's applying creativity, you know, all of those different mental and emotional capacities that you have, the more flexible you can be, the better, obviously, you're going to be able to adapt, and the more quickly you can adapt. I mean, just logical, right?
Yeah.
The interesting thing with that, with people who have been very, so there's a couple of elements. If you've been very successful in your career, one of the things that I've observed that with people that I work with, and this is where companies are often bringing me in as well, people get very successful on a very particular way of being and a very particular way of leading. And that in itself can become a little bit of, let's say, psychological inflexibility. So I've worked with people on this topic, and when we've talked about doing things a different way, it's almost like this defensiveness or protectiveness comes up, which is, well, if I'm not doing it that way, I'm no longer me. And that can feel like a real existential threat to people, you know. I'm going to go over there and not going to be me anymore. Or, you know, in this place, I can't be the real me.
Yeah.
So the more that you can uncover different ways of being, and the more you can uncover different ways of feeling comfortable being in different environments, that's really the underpinning of what it means to be mentally and emotionally flexible. Now, I can imagine a situation where people have received a shock, such as becoming redundant, being made redundant, and that could have the impact of making people really retreat into themselves. And again, applying that self-awareness and that self-reflection, if you feel as though you're getting into that place of being, or if you're getting feedback around, you know, being a little bit rigid about things, if it feels like there's too much and life is becoming too overwhelming, then what I would encourage is for you to reach out to a coach, maybe to you know, someone with more of a kind of therapy background or whatever it is, just to get some help to get out of that shell again and kind of get some help being a bit more flexible. Going down that very rigid, hyper-focused, narrow perspective can feel as though you're keeping things under control.
Yeah.
But the challenge when you move that overseas is there are lots of uncontrollables and lots of things that you can't anticipate. And that's where the stress and the downturn can happen. So really important to try and catch yourself in that and try and, you know, figure out some red warning flags that that's happening for you. Usually because your stress levels are rising and you just feel as though you're getting buffeted and overwhelmed. Okay, so I don't know if there's any questions there about resilience and so on. Just that's from the kind of individual point of view.
Yeah, I mean, just thinking about your point about being flexible. I haven't seen it with people that have moved abroad, but I've seen it very often with CEOs or business owners that have had to suddenly, you know, start doing social media, and to them it feels very inauthentic and, oh no, I don't want to do this, and they're very rigid about it. And sometimes, you know, they can be coaxed and coached around it, and there are some that resist it because, as you say, it doesn't feel like them. Yeah, and that's when difficulties can happen. So, you know, it's not just about when you move abroad, it's everywhere in life, isn't it?
Yeah. So I wrote an article, which I think is on LinkedIn, that said, you know, I can't remember the title, it was deliberately provocative, which was something like how to move overseas, ruin your career and get divorced in the process. You know, it was a little bit of a clickbait title, but it was about this topic, which is getting stuck on one way of doing things, and what can also happen is people get very, very hardworking, and it's almost like they feel as though as long as they're working hard, they're going to crack this nut. And that hyper focus means that their vision and their ability to see new opportunities just becomes narrower and narrower and narrower, and their ability to reach out and connect with people becomes narrower, narrower and narrower. So the antidote to that is about stepping back, and if you can do this, and it may take working with a coach or something to help you, start to plan for doing different activities and trying new things, and literally put that into your plan. I'm going to open myself up to new experiences. I'm going to try things I've never done before. I'm going to spend time not just building this business or this new career when I've moved overseas, but also looking at what else is happening in this new place around me, or what else, even planning for that before you move. Putting that as, part of one of the pillars in your plan of how to make this successful, because that is physically one of the ways of breaking out of that kind of hyper focus, which eventually just leads to And the title also touches on another challenge, which is when people do that and become very, very hyper focused, often the people who can feel a little bit neglected can be spouses, partners, families. Even families and colleagues that you've left back at home just don't, you kind of disappear off the face of the earth to them. So part of being resilient is also, as I said, it's about this skill of reconnecting all of these different threads in your life. So it needs to be broader than just the threads of your life around work. It has to be leisure, family, friends, old colleagues, and so on, because now you're part of a new picture and you bring in those different elements of your life. So don't forget to include all of those different facets of your life, and that helps you be more resilient overall.
Yeah, I can see that. Yeah.
Cool. Okay. The good thing about doing all of that is it helps you with the second element, which is around building your network. So in terms of building your network, what does that look like? First of all, I would say to people, if you've not done it already, you need to start working LinkedIn. LinkedIn, social media. I mean, Paula, you with your professional background prior to being a business psychologist, you know all about this element of how important your network is in terms of bringing opportunities.
Yeah, I love that phrase, your network is your net worth.
Exactly. So, building those connections, but there's a really good TED Talk, the name of which again escapes me, but it's about building your network, but not just based on the people that you know well, and not just based on kind of pinging from one to the other, who do you know well in your network and can you recommend me to someone? That's called a tight connection in terms. And this TED Talk was really describing the benefit of what's called loose connections. So when we're thinking about resilience and doing different things and rebuilding your life across the broad span, what you're also doing is creating possibilities from these loose connections, which are connections that come from, areas you may never have explored previously. And those loose connections are the ones where you're most likely to find your new opportunities, things you hadn't anticipated could come into. So one of the loose connection experiences I had was my husband took himself to a workshop that was when we moved here to France the first time. He took himself off to a workshop that was being run by an American psychologist. I can't remember the topic, but he didn't even know that it was an American psychologist that was running it. He was just interested in the workshop kind of title. And finding out that this chap was an American psychologist, he went to speak to him later and said, oh, my wife's also a psychologist and we've just moved over here and it'd be really cool to kind of connect you guys. And this guy was really interested. He was like, oh, that's great, give her my details. I then went and met with him, and then he then referred me to somebody in another country, and that person and I ended up working together for 12 years.
Wow.
So yeah. It was so random, whereas I had been trying, you know, the good girl thing of, you know, who do I know in my network who knows someone here who can tell me about job opportunities that are coming up?
Yeah.
But it was this really kind of random and spurious kind of network connection that brought that together.
So when you say build your network, are you talking about, say if you move to Greece or Italy, concentrating on people within those countries, or are you just talking in general?
I think it's the two things. So if you want to move to a particular country, obviously building connections with people who are in that industry in that country is great and fine, but why not build your network a bit more broadly as well? So you know, again, if you're building a whole life or a whole series of opportunities, connect with people who do, I don't know, diving or sailing ships or whatever randomness kind of interests you for some reason. You know, think about that broad swathe of life, but recognize that that can also bring to you opportunities that may fuel your career or your business growth or whatever it is you want to do out there. One of the pieces of research that's been done around personality and moving overseas is around people's openness to experience. So some people are very naturally open to that and it's part of their personality. If you know that you tend to kind of keep things a little bit close to your chest, but to be quite honest, you may not be thinking about moving overseas if that's you anyway. So embrace that openness to experience in terms of, and recognize it's something that will help you build your network as well. One of the keys to building your network is to have that one-liner in place. So if you want somebody to bring an opportunity to you, if you're very clear about what you do and how you help people, so it's almost like that would be your really clear one-liner on your LinkedIn as well. It needs to be so clear and so crisp and so short that after meeting you one time, someone is clear enough that they could refer you to someone if they hear about that. So the benefit of having that one-liner as well is that's almost like your toe in the door in terms of starting to build your reputation. If you can explain your unique value add in a very succinct way, in a way that people can repeat very easily, that is the start of your word of mouth reputation. So, and that, you know, get it on LinkedIn, get it on your social media profiles, start sharing it, put it on your CVs, and bit by bit, that plus the stories that you can tell about what you do and how you can create and add value for people in that new area you want to move to, that's the start of your reputation.
Yeah. So yeah, reputation was your third.
Yes.
Wasn't it? Yeah.
Exactly. And these days we have incredible tools at our disposal for building a reputation before we've even moved somewhere. You know, previously we had to get word of mouth to do that for us, or, you know, we're not all kind of famous yet in traditional terms, unfortunately, but now in terms of building our reputation online, and it also gets referred to as building your kind of personal brand. But really it's, you know, what are the stories that people know about you that tell others how you can create value for them? What is it, you know, what are the ways in which you serve people and that you help people? We found that to be really important in companies, because every time you move, literally nobody knows you. I mean, that sounds like the most obvious thing in the world. Nobody knows you, and nobody knows it's almost like the names on the door, or the, you know, the companies that you've worked for, and the people that, you know, the really good people that you've worked with. When you move overseas, those names may mean nothing to someone.
Yeah. And when you were just saying that, I mean, nobody knows you professionally, but even things like, you know, in the kitchen or getting a coffee, nobody knows you in all those circumstances. Yeah, yeah.
Exactly. When we see this really commonly, and people getting very challenged emotionally about it when people repatriate. So I remember working with somebody who had moved back to Paris after a really amazing 20-year career in New York. And they had worked with incredible companies, incredibly well-known names in New York. And you think, well, New York, you know, it's the epicenter of a lot of industries. And so surely just coming from, you know, just coming back to Paris and saying, I've had a stellar career in New York should be enough. And yet, you know, someone going to an interview and they're look, you know, the interviewer is looking at their CV and they're seeing these names, and these names, which would be big names, which will communicate something additional in New York, mean nothing in front of that interviewer. They don't know them. They may have heard a little bit, but all that other unspoken stuff just doesn't translate. So how do you get over that? How do you build that reputation? You, first of all, you know, being able to explain, this is what I'm here to do, this is how I help people, and being able to share stories that communicate how that value was created, what it was that you did. And it's almost like knowing your customer, you know, knowing your audience in your new environment. Join the dots for them so that they don't have to guess all of that unwritten stuff about what that means.
I suppose one way of doing that is, you know, in your CV or whatever, is, you know, this company had XXX turnover, or so many people, things that, you know, the company in Paris wouldn't necessarily know. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And think about what that company in Paris, or what that client in Paris, what are their, that's a kind of exploration. What are their drivers? Maybe their values aren't the same. So have a look, you know, do that research and have a look on their website about how they describe themselves. What's their mission in life? Maybe it isn't to make billions of dollars. Maybe it's about impacting the environment, or impacting communities around them, or something. So you've got to share those stories in a way that are meaningful with people in the new place that you want to go. And the more you have those conversations, so thinking about your network, you know, all of these steps build on one another. So if you're out there having conversations with people, listening to what's important to them, setting up those Zoom coffee meetings, even if you think, you know, this person may not have or know about jobs in your industry, but just getting really curious about what's important to these people, so that you can start sharing your stories and see how that lands and see how it's meaningful to them in a way that kind of captures their interest. That's really what it means to start building your reputation. And then what I would say is, utilize and leverage all of those platforms that you have available. So whether it's getting yourself on YouTube having conversations, whether it's getting yourself on podcasts, writing articles, how you position yourself on LinkedIn, you're basically creating a crumb trail for people to start finding you, and finding consistency in the stories that you're sharing. And that is how you're building your new reputation somewhere else. So yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's good advice for anybody, whether they're moving abroad or just want to build a reputation, you know,
Yeah,
for the future. Yeah.
definitely.
And I think what I would add to that, again, is thinking back to your strengths. So thinking about what you are good at. So if writing comes easily, then, you know, concentrate on the blogging, guest blogging for sites. You know, if you just procrastinate over writing, but love speaking, you know, think about the things that you can do, you know, video tutorials on YouTube, as you said, that sort of thing. So yeah, going back to your strengths, think about what comes easily to you. It's got to be fun, hasn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And also, and I guess you've seen this a lot as well, which is don't just show up as a unidimensional person. You know, show up as a whole person. You know, one of the first things you asked me on this video is, you know, don't just share who you are professionally. Tell us a bit about yourself personally. What have you where did you come from? That's one of the things that people ask, you know, someone they don't know. Where have they come from? What have they done? What's important to them in their life? You know, what does this tell me about this person?
Yeah.
So they're all very human things, but yeah, guarding against that kind of stressed, hyper focused, being very narrow and rigid, and just working harder. Again, it's broadening out. You're going through a process of broadening your base, and
Yeah.
that's the
Yeah.
key to remember.
And that actually resonates with something that somebody told me about. They worked for a pharmaceutical company and actually moved about every 18 months to 2 years. And her issue was that because everybody knew that she would be moving, nobody really particularly wanted to get sociable with them. They didn't want to, they'd invite them around to barbecues or whatever, but they didn't want to really connect with her because they didn't want that emotional investment and know that she would be going. And she found this particularly challenging. And again, that whole uprooting of, like, every time she uprooted, she had to build her home all over again. So one thing that she adopted was the gym. And so wherever she was, the gym became like another home. Used that. And she used sort of her sociability to create connections within the gym with these people who didn't know that she was going to be off in 18 months, 2 years. So she could build those connections there.
That's a really kind of clever strategy. I like that. Yeah, exactly. So there is kind of what I'm taking from that was there was almost kind of a negative baggage that was coming with her as well. And you know, if she could just move out of that context a bit, it would give her opportunities she wouldn't have found otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, and she loved going to the gym, and it was quite sociable, so it, you know, fitted her perfectly. Yeah.
Awesome. So yeah, those were my kind of 3 steps that I would recommend with people. So just kind of summarizing, work on developing that resilience first of all. You know, thinking about that tapestry metaphor and how you join up all the threads of your life in a new place. Building the internal resilience of yourself and your family and you know, your little system, your little part of the picture that is moving. And then building on your network, staying broad, and harnessing those loose connections, opening yourself up to those opportunities, and then working on, you know, building that reputation. What's that one-liner, that value add, and what are the stories, and how do they translate after you've moved overseas?
Yeah, and all of those things will serve you, you know, during your time abroad and when you come back as well. Yeah,
exactly. They are really 3 foundational steps for anybody who's going through a highly disruptive transition. So that will apply to someone in a redundancy situation, or you know, any of us in the pandemic, frankly, where we suddenly find our life getting blown up for some reason. You know, they're 3 really good life skills to have anyway, but they will help when you are moving your career overseas as well.
brilliant. That's been really useful. Thank you, Wendy. And all Wendy's contact details will be below, and yeah, we'll put some links into that, some strengths sites as well. Brilliant. Thank you.
Pleasure.